Hey crew, today we are talking about the F510 and the F511. These two documents are the duo that we use when the closing attorney is acting as the holder of the earnest money. So how do we know if the closing attorney is acting as the holder of earnest money? Because it's on the purchase and sale agreement. So on that very first page where it has holder of earnest money, if we name the closing attorney, it tells us right there in parentheses on the purchase and sale agreement must be used in combination with the 510 and 511. So this document being the 510. Okay. Now, when would the closing attorney hold the earnest money? Well, if you're with Keller Williams Atlanta Partners, our broker will only hold up to $5,000 of earnest money. So anything over that, we want to recommend that the attorney hold the earnest money. Okay. Sometimes the other side of the transaction is going to be insistent that the closing attorney be the holder of the earnest money, and that's perfectly okay. Either the brokers can hold it or the closing attorney can hold it. Those are all okay. Okay. But if the closing attorney is holding it, we've got some additional paperwork. That's our F510, closing attorney acting as holder of earnest money, where the buyer and the seller agree that the closing attorney is going to hold it, and the 511, where the closing attorney agrees to be the holder. Okay, so the F510, this document right here, this is an exhibit to the purchase and sale agreement. This is completed and sent with the offer. Okay, this is part of the initial contract. The 511 comes later, and this document's going to lay that out. So this exhibit is part of an agreement with an offer date of blank for the purchase and sale of property known as, and we've got the address, city, and zip code. Very simple. Okay. So in here, we are the closing attorney named to this agreement shall be the holder of the earnest money. They are subject to the closing attorney agreeing to hold it and signing the appropriate documents, meaning the F511, and it being timely delivered to the buyer and seller. Okay. So what this is telling us is if we've named the closing attorney as the holder of the earnest money, we've got a timeline to follow, and we need to be really conscientious of that. Okay. So when the closing attorney has been named as the holder, buyer must deliver to the closing attorney within 2 business days from the binding agreement date the fully signed and executed agreement in its entirety. Okay. So we immediately have to get the whole contract to the attorney, and we have to get them a copy of the escrow agreement, which is the F511, for them to agree to be the holder. Okay. Buyer must similarly deliver to the holder all amendments to the contract within 2 business dates, and that's in the future. Okay. Now, we've got 2 days to deliver the contract to the closing attorney. The closing attorney then has 3 days to agree to be the holder of the earnest money. Okay. Closing attorney named as holder shall not become the holder unless within 3 business days of the date of the closing attorney receives the entire contract, the closing attorney has countersigned the agreement of closing attorney to serve as holder. That's the 511, without change or modification, except for filling in blanks, and delivered it back to the buyer and the seller. Okay. At that point, they officially become the holder, and they have to agree to all the duties and responsibilities of the holder. Now, one of the very first things that they're agreeing to do is if they don't receive the earnest money, that the contract says that they're going to notify the buyer and seller. Well, closing attorneys do not want to be collection agents. Okay. They don't want that responsibility. So one of the things that you're going to find in the real world is closing attorneys won't sign the 511 until they've received the earnest money. So you need to plan for that, because what happens at the end of 3 days if they have not signed that? Well, then the alternate holder of the earnest money becomes the holder. Okay. So, and as we come down to paragraph 5, it says that if the closing attorney named as the holder has not become the holder because the closing attorney rejects being the holder, fails to timely become the holder, or becomes the holder but later resigns, the alternate holder named below who must be a broker in this transaction, shall automatically become the holder instead of the closing attorney. Okay, so understand in paragraph 8, we have to have somebody in here. Okay, in the purchase and sale agreement, we named, ABC attorney as the holder of the earnest money. Well, if ABC attorney didn't get the 511 within 2 days along with a full contract, if they don't sign within 3 days of receiving it, the contract, the 511, well, automatically the alternate holder becomes the holder of the earnest money. And if this is left blank, if this is to be determined, that means there is no holder of the earnest money. Okay, that's not an acceptable place to be. So we always have to have an alternate holder in here. And then we're going to fill in all the closing attorney's contact information here. Okay, buyer and the seller initial. So that's a pretty simple document, but it's really powerful, and it puts us on the clock, gives us the timeline we have to conform with. Well, once we have an accepted contract, now we've got to deliver that 511 to the closing attorney. And it was the buyer's responsibility for do that. And it tells us right here, should only be used when 510, closing attorney acting as holder, has been made part of the purchase and sale agreement. Okay, so for and in consideration of other valuable goods and services, the following law firm, ABC attorney, having been named as holder in the purchase and sale agreement by and between the buyer or buyer's names and the seller or seller's names, with an offer date of when was the offer made, for the property located at, and what was the address of the property. Okay, and this explains the terms. This is what they are agreeing to do. Okay, there is a reminder here of the need for this to be completed within 3 days, and what happens if they don't agree within 3 days. Okay, we then have the buyer and the seller's names in here. Why is the buyer and seller's contact information important? Because the responsibility of the attorney is to make sure the money is collected, and if it's not, to notify all parties that it hasn't been collected. Okay. Additionally, if the contract ever terminates and they have to disperse the funds, they need to know who to disperse it to and how to reach them. And then we have the buyer's agent information and the seller's agent information. And you will notice the only one down here that signs this is the closing attorney. Okay. So this one is a pretty simple form. And if they have the contract and if they have the earnest money in hand, I've never known an attorney not to agree to do this. But I want to point out one thing in here that a lot of people do not know. In paragraph 5 of the 510, so this was part of our agreement, earnest money must be paid to closing attorney acting as holder by wire transfer. So back on page 1 of the purchase and sale agreement, if we name the closing attorney to be the holder of the earnest money, we're not going to mark check, we're not going to mark cash, we're always going to mark wire transfer. Why? Because the contract later says that any funds paid to the closing attorney must be by wire transfer. Okay. So guys, if you've got any questions about this, call me, text me, email me. Don't be afraid to let the closing attorney hold it, but we're glad to hold it as well. And if you have any curiosity or want to know when would you not want the closing attorney holding it, that's going to be in cash transactions. Okay, because in a cash transaction, the closing attorney is not impartial. They are representing the buyer. Okay, in a typical one, unless specifically the seller has been named. In most cash transactions, they are representing the buyer. In your normal transaction, the closing attorney represents the bank. They represent the lender. Okay, so they're an impartial party. So if there's a disagreement between the buyer and the seller and the contract terminates, the closing attorney can make a decision, okay, because they're impartial. But when it's a cash transaction, they have a client in the deal. They can't be impartial. So in a cash transaction, if the closing attorney is holding the earnest money, the only remedy available to the closing attorney to resolve the dispute regarding the disbursement of earnest money shall be to interplead the funds into a court of competent jurisdiction. The attorney says, I'm not making a decision, take it to court. Okay? And you don't want to put your client through that either as the buyer or seller. So in a cash transaction, always have one of the two brokers hold the earnest money. Guys, that wraps us up for today. Call me, text me, email me with questions, and we'll chat at you soon.